For everyone's information, ISEAS is very committed in providing a safe platform for all parties to discuss, which involves both internal and external. ISEAS has a policy of zero tolerance towards sexual exploitations and abuse. Everyone is responsible in ensuring a safe environment. The inability to adhere to the conduct will cause further action to be taken. We believed that all parties will adhere to the information given, and we have a collective responsibility to create and to foster a safe discussion to all. To all our listeners and viewers out there, if you have any questions while the online discussion is going on, feel free to write down the questions in the chat room. We will be able to attend to these questions once all the presentations is over. And we also managed to save some time if we have those questions beforehand. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. And of course, a very pleasant morning I wish to all of you. The Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs Malaysia welcomes all of our panelists, experts, as well as our participants to the second ISEAS online discussion as part of our ASEAN Prosperity Index initiatives. The title of our discussions today is ASEAN's Digital Economy and the Post-COVID Recovery. ISEAS is very much delighted for such an interesting and timely discussion of the topic. We are joined by esteemed experts ranging from all sectors and industry. I would have the pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce to you the panels of experts today. The first speaker, we will have Dr. Jayant Menon, a visiting senior fellow from ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute of Singapore. Welcome, Jayant.
Thank you.
The next speaker, we have Dr. Jasmine Begum. Dr. Jasmine is the Director of Legal and Government Affairs in Southeast Asia and New Markets from Microsoft Malaysia. It's good to have you with us, Jasmine.
Thank you. Agree.
And last but not least, we have Surina Shukri, the CEO of Malaysia Digital Economic Corporation's MDEC, to be with us today. Welcome, Surina.
Good morning.
So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me just to run through all the insights and the nature of our discussions today. As we are all aware that the COVID-19 has incepted into the region of ASEAN, while ASEAN itself is facing its hurdles towards the fourth industrial revolutions. The industrial revolution is supposedly to position ASEAN to be more digital friendly with the areas of fintech, digital payments, health tech, e-commerce, edutech, every single thing that is based online and the Internet of Things. Indeed, on the surface, it looks very much superb and very much interesting, and we can speed up things when doing our business. But while we are doing this digital economy in our region, there is a valid concern actually that it further and its potential to further exacerbate the inequality within the region. While the modernized and modern cities able to catch up with the digital economy, we have seen our friends in marginalized communities, territories, women and children possibly could be left out. Now, it is an interesting fact actually, as of January 2021 alone, it is reported that 30% of ASEAN's total population remain disconnected from the internet, which many of these populations are concentrated in rural areas and marginalized communities. So we are actually seeing a disparaging effect of the big urbanized cities as well as the rural areas. As such, a very important questions that we can ask ourselves. How could actually ASEAN strategize this digital transformation to ensure the lower income households, marginalized communities, women to children are not left out with the equations today? So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let us listen to a round of presentations by our panel of experts, followed by some discussions as well as the Q&A sessions. With that, I would like to pass the floor to Jayant to speak over on the overarching situations in the region of ASEAN. Please, Jayant.
Thank you. Thank you, Zokhri, and good morning to all your viewers or listeners. I'm very pleased to be here for this event that ISEAS is hosting. So I will kind of set the scene, I guess, before we hear from the private sector and the government. So with that, let me start sharing my screen. Please let me know if you cannot see it or cannot hear me at any point, but hopefully this should work. Right, okay. I haven't heard from you, so I assume everything's good. Right.
It's good.
Yeah. So what I'll do in the next 10-15 minutes or so is, as I said, set the scene pretty much for the issues that I think my co-panelists will pick up a bit later on. I'll begin with saying a little bit about what you just said, Zokhri, in your introduction about how the pandemic's acceleration or the pandemic-induced acceleration towards the fourth industrial revolution and the digital economy may exacerbate inequalities. We're often told that COVID, sheds a spotlight on existing inequities and actually contributes to them as well. So we see them more clearly, and they are also increased as a direct result of the pandemic and our responses, government responses to it. But then I also want to say a bit about how the digital economy can also help in many ways deal with those apparent inequalities. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about this from the other panelists. Since I'm the scene setter, I want to look at the bigger picture of dealing with this from a macroeconomic point of view, the adjustment costs in the short run to the digital economy, the things that we can do to try and ease the pain to some extent. And here I'll focus on factor mobility and the role that trade reforms can play, and then I'll quickly summarize. Okay, so as you've mentioned, the pandemic is speeding up the journey towards a digital economy. Of course, the pandemic has forced us to speed up our adoption of a lot of these 4IR technologies. The best example, of course, is what we're doing right now. This seminar or webinar has been made possible by those types of technologies, but all kinds of service delivery is now possible in new ways because of this technology, including remote learning and work from home. And this has both positive and negative consequences. There's a very great likelihood that inequality between and within countries could rise, at least in the short run. I'm a believer that the long-term impacts will be net positive, but we live in the short run and we have to deal with these sorts of adjustments. And this rise in inequality can come from a number of sources. The most obvious, of course, is the unequal access of different groups within society, depending on your income class. So even in developing countries, the little infrastructure that's available is not equally accessible to all within the country. It depends on your income. But of course, between countries, there's different levels of preparedness, depending on your development stage. Again, here the obvious point is the developing countries are generally less prepared than the more developed ones, although they do have a latecomer advantage, and I'll come back to that maybe a bit later on. So within countries, the skills premium issue is one that might contribute to increasing wage inequalities. We've seen this play out in the developed countries quite dramatically, with the missing middle and those sorts of references in the US and in Europe. But I think the disruption to labor markets, what is often called labor churning, is the main concern in the adjustment phase. And here, the concern relates to, the biggest concern relates to job losses due to automation and robotics, which will first affect low-skilled repetitive tasks, very often in the supply chains. But then, of course, it can spread to more complex activities over time. So those are the negative impacts, all kinds of inequalities rising within and between countries. And we hear a lot about them. Perhaps what we don't hear as much about is how the digital economy can actually help directly address some of those inequalities, but also increase inclusion over time. And it's probably because it takes time for them to be realized that we don't hear so much about it. The negative impacts are more immediate and more obvious and of more concern. The positive impacts take time, more dispersed, so perhaps less coverage, although we often come across anecdotes, right? But there are important positive impacts, and I'd like to focus on just a few very quickly. And all of this is available without any sophisticated infrastructure. Increasingly affordable smartphones is sufficient. And of course, the more sophisticated equipment you have, the greater the benefit, but a simple smartphone will do. And the first is increasing connectivity. So here, developments in fintech, which I'm sure we'll hear more about later, will enable the more than 2/3 in ASEAN that remain unbanked. I worked in the Philippines for a long time before coming to Singapore, and the contrasts are very stark, where maybe 90% are unbanked, but that is changing rapidly. The poor now, through developments in fintech and with just a smartphone, can save in all kinds of new instruments, can borrow as well when they couldn't in the past. There's a lovely study by Robert Jensen that shows how fishermen and wholesalers in South India are able to share information through their smartphones, reduce price dispersion, eliminate waste, and really increase incomes of the very poor as a result of these sorts of improved connectivity. A lot of the poor still in ASEAN are in the agricultural sector, so we can, the digital economy can help farmers get better information on prices, on the weather, on all kinds of soil, seeds, and fertilizer details that can really help them improve their productivity. There's also a sharing economy that's growing, where an app can help you rent tractors and other expensive equipment that small-scale farmers wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. And this also, of course, goes beyond agriculture to all SMEs or MSMEs, micro and small medium enterprises. Blockchain technology is not just about cryptocurrencies. It's a platform that allows, increases the security of all kinds of cross-border transactions. And so even where the infrastructure is very weak in poor countries, this type of technology can allow the smallest of firms to engage in e-commerce and increase participation in the global economy from your remote villages. So there are lots of very positive things that can come from the digital economy, or the speed up towards the digital economy, and we should not forget them. But I think despite these positive offsets, the net impact in the short run is still likely to be negative. And here, the main concern is rising unemployment amongst the low skilled that are not very mobile. Their skills are usually not that transferable. And also the widening wage disparities due to the skills premium, where, if you have specialized skills, your returns are superlative. You have the superstar economy going on as well. And that's not just in the sports arena, but also in finance and so on. And all of these are adding to sharp rises in inequality that threatens, social cohesion and even political stability. So we need to try and do something about them. So to address these adjustment costs, it would be great if we could try and increase capital and labor mobility in the short run, at least. And this is to allow people to move more freely, especially when we have another long-term trend cutting in, which is divergent demographics. And this increases the need and the benefit, and in fact, the opportunities for increased factor mobility. ASEAN is aging, but not all of ASEAN is aging at the same rate. So the newer member countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, have relatively young populations, while most of the others are rapidly aging. And this is also true of the broader region, where we have, the East Asian countries aging quite rapidly, including China, Japan, Korea, and so on. But India is another country which has a very young population. So there's a lot of opportunities here for countries that have shrinking labor forces to open up their borders, to bring in much needed workers, especially in the lower skill categories, and also in those countries that have young populations to export labor, export their workers when they can't be gainfully employed at home. So this type of factor mobility can help with productivity catch-up and more inclusive growth by reducing the differences in capital labor ratios across ASEAN and beyond. Right. Now, the problem with all of this is that the pandemic is actually reinforcing trends that are moving in the opposite direction. Now, this happened before the pandemic. As we know, the pandemic actually is more of an accelerator than an inducer, but it's reinforcing feelings of nationalism. We've seen that with the vaccine distribution, feelings of protectionism. Now, protectionism, of course, has a new name every few years. After the global financial crisis, it was called rebalancing the economy. Then more recently, it was called reshoring. Now there's signs that resilience is the new name. There's good aspects of increasing resilience, but it can be exploited by protectionist forces to protect their market shares at home. So all these fears are rising during this period of insecurity with the pandemic. They didn't start with the pandemic, but the pandemic has heightened them and accelerated them. So the potential to increase labor mobility, for instance, is unlikely to be high. At the moment, it's very low. Borders are still largely closed, especially in Asia. But even after the pandemic ends, whenever that is, it's likely to linger. These factors are likely to linger into a new normal. So the appetite for this kind of reform, unfortunately, is likely to be low for quite some time, even in a post-pandemic new normal. So what can we do? Well, I think this is where a less sort of, sensitive or contentious reform package involving trade reforms can partly substitute for those difficult to do factor movement reforms. They can produce similar, not identical, but similar outcomes. So even if you can't increase, say, labor or capital mobility, if you can get more trade that uses those factors, labor and capital, more trade between these countries, then at least factor prices can start equalizing and reduce adjustment costs. I can come back to this later. It's a bit more complicated, but it is a partial substitute for factor mobility and can partially offset the adjustment costs coming out of the digital economy. And so regional agreements like the ASEAN Economic Community, the recently signed RCEP and CPTPP and so on, as well as the WTO, will have to play a much more important role right now and in a post-pandemic new normal in keeping borders open, borders that remain relatively open for goods, but it must help in opening borders to services and people movement, and also continue for trade in goods and services. Okay, so I've already hit my time limit. So let me quickly conclude by summarizing the key points. I think it's true that the pandemic's push towards digital economy will worsen inequality between and within countries, but it will also help increase inclusion in some areas. But the positive aspects will not outweigh the negative in the short run, at least. And so we need policies that will address or reduce these short-run adjustment costs. The best policy would be to increase the cross-border movement of labor and capital. But unfortunately, that appears unlikely, increasing these movements because the pandemic is pushing in the opposite direction. It's reinforcing the long-standing backlash against globalization, which also grew out of inequality, by the way. The benefits of globalization were not seen as fairly distributed amongst different groups in society or between countries. So the pandemic will reinforce that and so reduce the appetite for factor mobility when we need it the most. So this is where trade reforms, which we've been much better at, can play a role or must play a bigger role to substitute for the reduction, actually, in factor mobility we can expect for a while yet. Factor mobility has fallen sharply because of the pandemic, and it's likely to linger for quite a while. So trade has to grow because it can partly substitute for those sorts of factor mobility or the outcomes of increased factor mobilities. Rewards to labor and capital, which is wages and rentals, can be equalized by increasing trade. And this is what will help us in the short run in adjusting to these sorts of shocks. But in the long run, more systemic changes will be required to address the many challenges posed by the Fourth Industrial Revolution, including rising inequality. And this includes, for instance, transforming our education system, bringing in lifelong learning, increasing flexibilities, right? Allowing people to move around, skill categories more easily in the future, and also creating deeper local capital and financial markets to raise the kind of capital that we need to finance growth. And this includes venture capital and all those sorts of things. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about this from our other speakers, but let me stop there. I'm sorry for going a bit over time, and return it back to you, Zokhri. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayant. Ladies and gentlemen, our second speaker, Dr. Jasmine Begum, will be speaking on leveling the digital playing field in ASEAN and how tech can be leveraged to truly be an enabler to the public-private partnership. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Zokhri. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to share today. And I'm just going to share my screen. So I think Jayant has addressed largely what fits perfectly into what I want to share and what enables that. I think it was interesting to note that Jayant talked about the free flow of people and capital. And I would like to advocate for the free flow of data as well, which seems to be one of our biggest challenge today as we look to, I think you used the word resilience, to build resilience and to drive protectionism, actually. And that's something that I want to talk about. I'd like to start by talking about, we are in a world that's looking to search for certainty. And we are faced with this new digital business models. And these are tools that are available today. Exactly to your point, Jayant, that we are here in a webinar only because we can't meet in a room and have this robust discussion. And remote working is not going to be something of the past. I think it will continue to be going into the future. When the world become a platform for employment, the world would also become a platform for entrepreneurship. And we are going to be driven largely by a digital world where we are facing legacy policies and legacy laws and legislations that look to regulate the analog world. Here we are going forward. We are faced with a pandemic that it started as a health crisis that became a social crisis and then an economic crisis. And all of these new opportunities that the pandemic actually has presented, the biggest challenge that we have today is actually very much anchored on legacy policies. And that seemed to be an area that where we could do more to actually progress and use this to accelerate, even rip and replace some of the challenges that we are facing today. ASEAN is the 5th largest market in the world, largest economy in the world. And what does that mean today to individual countries? How are we using this opportunity to actually to build a single market? It seems like we have an opportunity to reset at this point, and technology can play that role. Therefore, I would like to go back to what Jayant said in closing, that while the free flow of people and capital continues to be a challenge, I think we want to leverage that free flow of data as an opportunity to build this new economic platform. But what remains as a challenge? Sorry, I keep moving this. Oh, sorry. What remains as our biggest foundational challenge is that there is still the ASEAN digital divide. And that digital divide, which is foundational for building this single platform and digital economy that we all want to drive, is that connectivity. I think Jayant spoke about the disparity and the huge disparity that we are faced today. And in order for us to move as a single platform, in order for us to at least have somewhat an equal footing, the digital infrastructure is going to play a big role. And in addressing that, I think we need to also address that there continues to be an ASEAN digital divide. And if at each country we look at this divide, how are we addressing it? I know different countries were inundated with huge education issues when children couldn't go back to school, or they didn't have the device. Just the way our geography is, across the region, the way we are laid out, there are so many challenges. And what are we doing today to address some of those? And in talking about digital opportunity, if we do not address the divide or the challenges that become foundational in progressing this conversation, it would be truly a remiss. And I think as we think about technology as transformational as it is important we actually address the digital divide as well. I think going back to the building of the recovery and economic recovery and resilience, technology is a platform. We recognize that. Innovation as a culture and something that as a region we have embraced. I think we have embraced both technology as a platform as well as innovation as a culture. And skilling has become the currency, the new currency, and we recognize that. And I think all of ASEAN recognizes that fact. And ASEAN has an opportunity to drive a proactive agenda for governance, digital infrastructure that looks at regulatory coherence, privacy standards, and data sharing. And I think that is how I would look at the opportunity presented by the pandemic today. We have an opportunity to relook and recognize that as individual countries, we could move, but as a region, we have a greater opportunity as a gateway to the rest of the world. And this is my last slide, and I want to focus on, and I talked about this at the outset, free flow of data is going to be that opportunity. Continued relooking at localization of data or data residency is not going to help any country or the region. And I understand where governments are trying to restrict free flow of data because data gains and all that goes around with it. But in order for the digital economy to prosper, there is a need for the free flow of data. The challenge today is most organizations do not know what is in their data estate. That includes governments, and therefore they are not able to get the insight. Digital infrastructure is another area where we really need to look at how this is not regulated, or how do we organize digital infrastructure. Some countries, as I'm aware, are looking to introduce licensing model, which could be seen to be not pro-business, or which could increase the cost of doing business for companies that want to invest. I talked about skills as a new currency, and as a region, we have an opportunity to recognize skills. We have an opportunity to look at hiring across border, and this is now an opportunity to look at the digital workforce as a region. And how do we actually work together to recognize some of these skills and cross-recognize and make it available for the citizens of ASEAN. Finally, I want to talk about the digital free trade agreements. We have seen Singapore has done this so well. They have signed with New Zealand, they have signed this with Australia. And here's an opportunity for ASEAN to be the front runner, to drive digital free trade agreements or digital economy agreements that as they are known in Singapore. Here's truly an opportunity, how countries can come together and recognize FTAs in the new form. And I think if we do not take this opportunity to address any of this, there is no other compelling factor. And I think today I hope to have this robust discussion addressing some of these policy opportunities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move to the third speaker. Surina Shukri of MDEC will be speaking on how MDEC, the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, is preparing Malaysia for the fourth industrial revolution and how it will ensure that no group is left behind. Surina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum and good morning to everybody. And so I took notes as Sir Jayant was speaking, as well as Dr. Jasmine, and of course these themes around inequality is very, very key, because at the center of it, we must make sure that whatever it is we build, whatever it is that we do, it's inclusive. And I think that's consistent. Even at Davos, they talked about multi-stakeholder. They talked about so this theme, we see it very clearly. Point number one. Number two, Jayant also talked about the need to also digitalize traditional sectors like agriculture, like micro SMEs, so that no one is left behind. And Dr. Jasmine, of course, talked about the whole ASEAN as an opportunity, and tech as a platform. I'm also going to touch on all that, touch a little bit about what we're doing here in Malaysia, but also talk a little bit about how just as important as as policy making is, implementation is actually really, really important as well. And I share this unique perspective coming from private sector, and then moving into government. So now I have a better perspective in terms of how things are done and how we need to think about things to actually mobilize and make things happen. So I'm going to share my screen. And thematically, we all talk about technology, we all talk about digital, we all talk about the future. One second. Yeah. And the future as being the future, but really, I posit that the future is literally now. We are literally living and breathing it every day. And of course, the pandemic has really made us realize that we now live in a world that's digital by default. Oh. Yeah, so if you look at what happened in 2020, the whole world, digital economy was accelerated. If you look at studies that Google had published last year, we saw 5 years worth of consumer digitalization happen in 1 year. 2 years worth of business-to-business digitalization happen in 1 year. So a lot happened in 2020, and the likes of agencies like us at MDEC, we're busy answering distress calls from the industry, big technology partners like Microsoft as well, doing the same thing, answering distress calls, like how do you deal with this new world where everybody realizes it's digital by default. We also saw a lot of effort by the government also last year, governments all around the world, various initiatives to stimulate the economy, to drive adoption, and whatnot. And so last year there were many different initiatives that was done, but one of the key contributions that MDEC had worked towards was ensuring that digital was a national agenda. And so sure enough, last year we saw through many discussions at the top of the house with the Economic Action Council, many topics around digital infrastructure, all those things that we talked about earlier did rise to the top of the house. And there were now we're on our way towards building. We've adopted digital as a national agenda. And of course, the other theme that happened last year, of course, was just this insatiable demand for knowledge, which is great because before, it was not as much. So when we fast forward to today, the momentum, of course, continues. 2021, we've seen a rapid, we've seen particularly across all the different sectors. You may argue many sectors were affected by the pandemic, but the technology and digital sector was one that continued to demonstrate resiliency, and of course, expansion into non-digital sectors as well. We hear initiatives around the need to digitalize businesses continues, the need to digitalize micro businesses also continues. So for example, this week alone, we just launched a national initiative primarily targeted towards onboarding micro SMEs onto e-commerce. So working very closely with all the different e-commerce platforms in the country. And this year, we're trying to target onboarding 50,000 new micro SMEs, the ones that have never sold online before, selling online. And through the various different initiatives, be it through an e-wallet or a payment system, or just learning how to use influencers to sell, we hope to benefit 300,000 businesses, local businesses. So there's plenty going on. And then last week, the country also launched the national 4IR policy. So the momentum continues around the path for digitalization. But where are we now? Let's pause for a second. So what's happened right now, when you look at just the evolution, and you can track the evolution of digital economy in Malaysia by tracking the evolution of MDEC, because MDEC was first founded 25 years ago with a vision of building up the ICT industry, so basically the digital industry for Malaysia, and now 25 years later, digital accounts for at least the unofficial number for 2020 is about 20% of the GDP. And of course, this number is expected to increase. DOSOM actually released e-commerce numbers just yesterday and says that over the last 3 years, we have seen a threefold increase in the e-commerce space alone, which of course counts for a big part of the digital economy. Now, when you look at that, what's the difference now? So you look, the past 25 years has really been all about building up the market. So this chart that you see over here, this is a simplified, I view it as it's a typical technology adoption curve. So of course, the first part of it is when you're thinking about technology, you're dealing really with the innovators and the early adopters. They represent the first 15% usually, right? And these consist of tech enthusiasts, the visionaries, and how they are motivated is very different than mainstream. The tech enthusiasts and visionaries, they have higher risk tolerances, and what they need really is just a flexible place to take on risk. So some incentives here and there. Then there's this concept of crossing the chasm, which really is all about making sure people understand and going through that leap. So then you start dealing with the early majority, the pragmatists, which is basically where we are now. Now, this driving adoption with this group of people is very different than the early adopters. And so what they need really is a lot of more awareness, education, advocacy, community engagement, and so that you can build on momentum and continue. And so following that, you have the late majority, so which really are typically conservatives. And this is where what's required to get them to adopt really, they're less motivated by incentives, they're less motivated by, it's almost like you have to force them. And so this is where policy and regulation like really come in. And then finally, you have the skeptics, the laggards, the ones that can't afford to adopt. And so this is where you really, really need inclusion and social responsibility. So now, as policymakers, and I know a lot of people on this call are thinking through that lens, just think of it as like, this is the iPhone adoption chart. And so the people that fall into different categories, and they need different things to adopt, right? And so you've got friends that are the crazy ones that would actually line up and be the first to get their iPhone. And so they don't need policies for that. But when you're dealing with the mainstream, that's when policy is quite important, because you can educate people about the iPhone and then maybe they will buy it, or you can force people through policy and say everybody needs an iPhone, they buy it. So I simplify this a little bit just to add some color and context for us all. It's really important to understand where we are in the digital adoption curve. Now, overall, across the region in ASEAN, and then primarily in Malaysia, we are at the stage where digital is now democratized. So we've crossed the chasm, it's come into the mainstream market. And so everybody needs digital, everybody wants digital. And so how do we go about doing that? It's democratization of digital. And so with the development of the Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint, that is really all about democratizing digital. So this is taking on board digital as a national agenda with the recognition that you need, it's not just government, it's all across government, private sector, and individuals as well. And the key core themes is all about making sure that there's benefits towards the people. And so skilling of the people is really, really important. And there's plenty of initiatives that relate to that, policies and the way that relate to that, businesses, and of course, government. And government plays a very important role in the blueprint in terms of making sure that there is a conducive enabling environment. So therefore, connectivity is a core part of this, very, very central part of the digital economy blueprint. I think many of you may have heard of Jendela, so there's lots of connectivity related developments that's in there. And of course, government as well is committed to digitalizing themselves too, which is something that I'm really excited about. Everything from adopting cloud to ensuring that there's digital literacy amongst civil servants. Now, as we think about the journey, as this journey continues, where do we go from here? Today, I like to think of, it's not digital economy, digital is the economy. And so it's not so much, you can't really, it's becoming harder and harder to put, boundaries on what is digital economy really, because, digital it cuts across. We talked about agriculture earlier, right? So agriculture, now you're starting to use technology into agriculture. So eventually, we have to have this mindset of digital is the economy. And then when we think about digital transformation, a lot of people tend to think about the tools that's required. Okay, what tech do I need for my business? But the reality of it is that digital transformation is human transformation, because you can't do it without the whole skilling thing that both Jayant and Dr. Jasmine talked about. And so it's just this whole new different mindset that's required. And then finally, not too distant around the corner, beyond digital. So we think big words, 4IR, there's all these big, what is IoT? You hear all about block, all these multiple technology things, but really what is 4IR? The fourth industrial revolution is about hyperconnectivity, because everything is connected now. And then intelligence that's required to leverage all of that. And so within all these things that we talked about, fourth industrial revolution is really all about hyperconnectivity and intelligence. And so as we think about ASEAN, how do we build an ASEAN that's hyperconnected? These are all themes that is required to think about. And the vision, as we think about going forward, at least us at MDEC, we think of a nation that's deeply integrated with technology, that empowers this inclusivity that we just talked about, sustainability and shared prosperity. And how do you do that? One of the things so the tenets to this vision is shared prosperity, leveraging for our globally connected, and we need to make sure that we invest in the people aspect of it, the talent aspect of it. We need well-rounded citizens. And of course, at the same time, we take care of Mother Earth. So over the next 10 years, what can we expect? what's happening, what's practical, what really, as we're designing policies, what is it all about? So if you look at the middle there, so the numbers, this is just to demonstrate. Sometimes we think 10 years is very, very, very far away. But the reality of it is that it's sooner than you think. You blink and then your child is already, 12 years old, and then you blink again, they're going to university. So here, what I have in the middle in the black there, these are just some of the goals that Malaysia has committed to via the digital economy blueprint. So jobs, creating an extra 500,000 jobs, doubling the number of startups, having a Malaysian unicorn, digitalizing 875,000 micro SMEs, making sure that there's 100% internet access, 80% of the government adopting cloud, increasing productivity. So these are some of the goals that's out there. So how do we get there? But at the same time, I also highlight some of the things happening around in the region as well, so that we're aware. So number one, an important thing is the internet economy in Southeast Asia. We talk about lots of growth. That's expected to grow 3 times from where we are today with the next, through 2025. And then of course, Southeast Asia is expected to become the 4th largest economic bloc, and overall global growth is expected to come from Asia. And then at the same time, there's lots of things happening outside. When you look at like the way the other advanced economy continues to grow, and even more excitingly, it's growing outside of Earth. So already Elon Musk is thinking about, in not so many years, certainly within the next 10 years, the expectation is we'll be ready to be living in Mars already. So therefore, policies is really important, but making sure that they become practical is also another thing. So how do you go about doing that? Number one, so here's as MDEC, as we think about making it practical, all those policies, all of those, how do you implement that? So number one, it's really, really, really important to scale through partners. So that's why private-public partnerships are key. And so Dr. Jasmine, Microsoft, has committed to helping to train and reskill 1 million Malaysians. And so partnerships like that is really, really important. So scale through partners. Number two, build digital platforms. And so so how do you leverage digital to enable that? And digital platforms, can be as big and complex as facilitating cross-border trade, that's something that customs would need, or it could be as simple as what 3 kids just announced yesterday. They built an app to help people find food banks with this whole white flag movement, but leveraging digital. Figure out ways to drive commercial sustainability, and so there's ways to do that. We talked about underbanked just now. We talked about inclusivity. And so by leveraging digital, for example, when costs are, it lowers down the cost, it enables you to actually serve more. And then the innovation aspect of it. So Dr. Jasmine talked just now about innovation as a culture. And I really, really think that it's really important, because we are at the stage where we need to, like, operating in the usual case is not going to cut it anymore. We're running up a race against time. So we really need to challenge ourselves to come up with leapfrog strategies. How do you go about doing that? How can we do things faster? And then finally, you solidify all of that with policies, right? And so what are the enablers for all of this? We've got policy, but within every single organization, you need to enable the implementation, whether you're government, whether you're a think tank, whether you're a big company, you're a small company. It all starts with teams. So you need you need skilled people on your teams, which is something that Mr. Jayant talked about just now. And so how do you encourage agile teams? Because And what do I mean by agile teams? It's just teams that's able to respond very quickly to different stimulants out there. For example, a case in point, you know, when we did business planning 2020, in January 2020, did we think that we would have the year 2020 happen? No, none of us did. And then in fact, so then I thought, so this is just sharing a personal example. And so that year, 2020 was a year full of disruption, and, you know, we pivoted and did all sorts of things. And then 2021 came around. So January 2021, my business plan says, this year is going to be like this, and here are our plans, but not realizing that, well, it's pivoting again. So we really need these agile, innovative teams. And when you think about, so secondly, adopting digital. And so every company needs to recognize their digital, where they are on the digital journey. So if you're not there, you establish your digital presence. And then you start to digitalize first you digitalize your front office, then you digitalize your middle office, then your back office, then you start doing all the fancy schmancy AI type things. You also need to think about data. So Dr. Jasmine just now talked about the need to share data and build data infrastructure, but it's really, really important for every single organization, not just, you know, because policy is one thing, affecting it is another. And so you need to understand where you are on the digital maturity curve and really, you know, take it amongst every individual to embrace data, to understand data. And of course, risk management. And so oftentimes, by not investing in risk management, a lot of these transformation agenda doesn't work as well. So for example, if you are thinking about data policy and data sharing, I'm just giving an example, but you're not thinking through the lens of, okay, so what is, how is the risk department and audit department going to respond to this? You might have, you know, sharing of data, but then the audit department will say, no, I need actual physical hard copy of XYZ. Otherwise, you know, I'll fail your audit. That doesn't work either. So we need to continue to invest in risk management as well. And so from an MDEC standpoint, there's many things to do. I'll just share our core focus areas. We've got a lot of our plate, but when we think about what's required to push ahead, we've simplified everything and just think of it as these 4 fundamental areas. New skills, because we need to invest in the people agenda, and it's all about skilling. So we've got a very big digital skilling agenda. Adoption, so how do you continue to drive adoption? Disruptors, so how do you encourage this new disruptive thinking, startups, technology, innovation, et cetera, and then finally investments, because we still need to continue to invest in digital, and the country also from Malaysia continues to need digital investments. So how do we go about doing that? So NADI coincidentally spells Nadi, which we think it's the pulse of the digital economy. So that's what we do. And then finally, of course, like I said, when you do all this, we have to remember that every organization, we must also invest in the other facets to make sure that whatever policy, whatever strategy that's in place can support that. So making sure that talent, technology, operations, finance, controls also is on board on the digital transformation journey is key. I'll skip this one because this is really just to show the breadth of the platform, like what we're onto, all our different things. And then finally, it's really important that in order to make innovation work, in order to accelerate execution, adoption, it really is all about cross-functional teams. If you look at, all the way at the top of the house, digital economy blueprint, there's 6 different clusters that's required, and they're all interlinking. So you need talent, you need the tech part of it, the infrastructure part of it. So it's really all about making sure that you've got cross-functional teams, cross-functional collaboration. And this whole notion of stronger together, I think is really important. So with that, that is my thoughts for the day. So policy is really, really important, but equally important is implementation of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Surina. Thank you to all speakers for all of the points that you have deliberated. I mean, I can't get enough time to actually jot down all of the points, but I do still I remember some striking points, which probably it's important for us to reflect. Now, when Surina said that COVID gives us digital by default, it gives us the understanding that, well, even though that we are not ready, but we just have to be ready with digitalizations, not because of the fourth IR, but because of COVID. I still remember in March last year, I was still in an academic institution and suddenly everything just go online. We never had an opportunity to test run this before, and suddenly everything just goes online. We all have to go into Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and Google Meet, something that we did not actually pay attention before COVID happens. So again, what is actually happening in ASEAN? Is it also probably the similar pattern and a similar trend in other regions? I think perhaps, Jayant, if you probably have any insights on that, are we seeing a general pattern across all major regions in the world, or is it ASEAN is the one that greatly impacted by COVID-19 and digital by default?
Right. Okay. To get so that I understand your question correctly, Zokhri, I guess what you're asking about is whether ASEAN's performance in COVID and digital compared to the rest of the world. Is that right?
Yes, and also, is this also happening in other regions? The issues are also lingering in other regions in the world.
Right. Okay. So so let me start with broader issues relating to that question. So I think with COVID, Asia, I think has done relatively well at the start. We did, manage it quite well in the beginning. It started in Asia, in China, but then, a response was swift, and we managed to community outbreaks quite well. ASEAN did quite well originally as well, right? Now we are seeing that this new variant has put everyone at risk. Even countries that have done very well, like Malaysia, Thailand, suffering, spikes that are the highest that they've seen. Even the, so-called superstars, right, are not immune. Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, everyone is at risk with this new variant because of the increased transmissibility. And the bigger concern now, of course, is the the rollout in the vaccines is unequal also. In Asia, or ASEAN, apart from Singapore and surprisingly Cambodia, the uptake is lagging behind the US and Europe significantly. So there I think is where the problem lies, catching up now with the vaccination, and they're both supply, demand, and logistical issues that need to be addressed there. On the digital economy, I guess, so again, I spoke about the variation within ASEAN. Of course, the more advanced economies in the West, US, and Europe have done well, have been, earlier in preparing, and have been, uptake has been a lot higher. But there are, success stories within Asia and ASEAN. I mean, again, there's great variation there, but there is latecomer advantage as well. So, for instance, when I was at ADB, I worked a lot on Cambodia and how, through new technologies in, say, battery storage, and so on, you can come up with solar farms in remote areas that don't have access to electricity, that can bring power to poor communities in an isolated way. You don't need to invest heavily in the infrastructure to link up to the grid. You can the savings from linking up to that national infrastructure can be put into solar farms that are decentralized, that are much more environmentally friendly and much more cost effective now that solar panels and the batteries have come down in price as they become more efficient as well. So, there are, latecomer advantages. And of course, in telecom, it's a very clear example. Countries like Cambodia and Laos are, I think, not even bothering anymore with the fixed line technology investments now that they can actually just move directly to mobile telephony. So, so there are pluses and minuses of being late or slow. But overall, of course, there is quite a bit of catch up, I think, as Surina was mentioning in her presentation. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Now, Jasmine, in your legacy policy, you've highlighted the 4 key areas that we probably should pay attention to, like the free flow of data, digital infrastructure, digital of FTA, and skills as the new currency. Now, how do you think that the National 4IR policy and the National Digital Economy Blueprint, as briefly mentioned by Surina just now, which was just announced by the government of Malaysia last week, actually reflect onto these legacy policy key points that you have raised in your presentation?
I want to tie what you've just asked to what Surina said about operationalizing of these policies. Policies are such fundamental enablers for us to, progress. Unfortunately, we continue to see a gap between what comes out in these policy documents like the Digital Economic Blueprint and the 4IR Blueprint, but when it gets translated down, we continue to also see contradictory policies or guidelines that come out that causes a lot of confusion, right? So what is important is to have that base understanding. And in order to accelerate and to drive with a sense of urgency, I think it may be important that that we look at legacy policies as those in the past, and we actually embrace and maybe even build ground up some of these digital policies. And to Surina's point, she talks about digital is economy. And if digital is economy and we are trying to force fit some of this digital policy into the legacy analog policies, it is not going to allow you to accelerate. There will be continuous confusion, especially at where the policy becomes implementable or where we need to implement. We see these high-level policies that provide direction, but when it comes to implementation and when it comes to operationalization, there is a huge misunderstanding or there's a huge gap in the understanding. So to me, in order for us to actually embrace and reap the benefits of these more recent policy documents is to have supporting policy guidelines or regulations that actually further explains how it is to be operationalized, or else we are going to be in that conundrum of beautiful policy documents with challenged, which faces challenges when it comes to implementation.
Allow me to be a bit critical on that, because I think both Jasmine and Surina said about the implementation, and Jasmine repeatedly says on the operationalizations of that policy that will actually make this policy work. But isn't it implementation and operationalization is actually a behavior of a human. It is actually a skill, and it cannot be addressed by papers. It cannot be addressed by what you're written on the papers, but it's more on the awareness and the conscience, and obviously the efficiency of a human to make whatever that is written on the paper work. So if implementation is the problem that we are currently facing as the gap between the policy and the results, I'm a bit speechless at how actually that we can actually do that, because these are actually human behaviors or management skills of a human. Any comments from anyone?
So let me just give an example. Sometimes, let's just take it, let's start at a micro level, like just take any organization, okay? So any company. So the equivalent of policy literally is strategy, because that's what you say you're going to do. That is your policy for the year. So this year you do XYZ. Now, if that policy or strategy is not married with implementation, i.e., do you have your basic finances right? Did you budget? Did you put money alongside that? Is that going to work? It's not going to work. If you have like a hiring freeze and you say, oh, we want to do this, but you cannot hire anybody. You have, so that's not going to work either. So my point is, when you come up with policy, it's the onus of the organization to make sure that there's a corresponding implementation plan as well. So you're investing right, so you're allocating the appropriate resources to implement that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen if you just throw something out, and then you need to marry that up with the proper things too. So so if you take it at the national level, policy, yes, everybody says we're going to do X, Y, Z, but then how do you then make sure that you've got resources aligned to do that? And so if you're trying to make, if you're trying to increase investments, though your policy says increase investments, but then suddenly you say, oh, I'm going to license everybody and charge and collect fees for that. That's not encouraging investments. So it's it doesn't work towards that policy. So policy often, like I really do think that where we're going towards, Dr. Jasmine talked about building, having all these policies on top of analog. So reform is actually needed. I'll give you an example. Like today, we talked about data. Yeah, we talked about data sharing, et cetera, and we all want to share data. And there are ways that you can do that to share data. For example, you can anonymize data and then share it. You can aggregate data and then share it. But to do that, it requires skill to do that. Otherwise, everybody's going to say, no, this data is restricted. It's top secret. I'm not going to share it. That's the easy way out, because that's classifying something as top secret. That everybody knows how to do that. But aggregating and anonymizing data, people don't know how to do that. But then corresponding policies to say everybody needs to get educated, take time off and we don't have that. And then corresponding policies to say we need to as bring more data people into the organization, into the government or whatever to understand this. We don't have that either. So my point is, when you think about implementation policies, yes, it's one thing, but you need to think about how you operationalize that. So therefore, cross-functional leadership teams is important, because one guy, of course, you've got because policy is about strategy and economics, it's big picture. But then how do you make that happen? So that's why you need if this is a company, then CEO, CSO will think about strategy, policy, and then you've got your operations and your finance team to think, okay, then how do we implement, how do we operationalize that? So it has to be, that's why I talked about the importance of making sure that you've got a team to execute as well. And so oftentimes it's really, really important to have the policy, but make sure that you can marry it with the execution. And I think particularly in a place like Malaysia, that execution implementation part, that's the part that we've always, we still have a lot opportunities there to improve the way that we execute.
Right. Now, isn't it the end user's acceptance is also a key role to ensure that whether those policies are actually in place? As far as MDEC's advocacies campaigned on digital economy or any kinds of digitalizations in the country, in general, how do we evaluate the acceptance of Malaysians towards digitalization, Surina?
Yeah, so this is where I talked about momentum earlier. When I joined in 2019, a lot of the advocacy work that we were doing was really around, hey guys, it's time to go digital. Why don't you go digital? And then you get, what is digital and why? So it was a lot of conversations around that. Even among the SMEs, it was the sense that we got was, hey, you try first. No, you try first and you try first. But I think what COVID has done is people really recognize that digital is the way forward, and it's no longer a question of why, it's a question of how. So a lot of the advocacy work that we're doing, along with all the other partners that we have, it's really educating people on the how. How do you open an online store? How do you actually do digital marketing? How do you do all these things? So the appetite is there. Everybody's asking now, hey, how do I do online at home? How do I study? How do I teach my kids at home? So the why is already there, and so a lot of people are there's a dearth for like, how do I leverage digital?
Right, thank you. And we also hope that this trend is also consistently happening in the region. I remember Jayant puts his point as in order for us to weather COVID-19 with digital economy, we must invest in capital, labor mobility. Jasmine adds on data mobility. So I think if we have capital, labor, and data in place and we invest on them, hopefully the digitalizations will become a culture in the region. And it becomes something that we habitually doing from day to day. All right, let's just pause our reflections for a moment. We've got some questions from the floor. And again, we welcome our viewers, our listeners to also ask questions to our speakers, as this is the time for us to interact with our speakers with your questions. Now, let me start. I'm sure that each and every one of us will have access to the questions. Questions by Rizal Ishak. I'm just going to read and quote his questions, and then I will ask these questions to our panelists. I am developing digital solutions around green steps, where we develop low carbon communities. From what I observed, digital adoption is really low. For example, Malaysia ranked #2 in ocean plastic pollution, which starts from our rivers. We are now having communities, households, and business source separate waste and mapping them to local processes such as composting and upcycling plastics, creating jobs too. For something like this, how can the government assist? I think I would probably ask Surina, and then probably if Jayant would like to add on to the points as how can perhaps an authority or a government can assist in the problems of creating jobs, as well as I think the other problem is to have the awareness, I think. Yeah, so Surina, if you want to take that question.
So this question, it sounds like there were two separate themes in there. So one around digital, but separately it's just pollution, taking care of the environment, and so forth and so forth. And so the question is, what can the government do as far as helping to care for the environment is concerned? And then there's a little bit of how can you leverage innovation in that, which is basically what I heard in that question. The answer is the government can actually do a lot. It's just a question of where is it in the prioritization on their priorities list. And so I'm a big believer that we need to, so this is not like the official government view, but I'm a big believer that taking care of environmental things, that's actually the biggest opportunity for government, really, because that is almost like it's common to everybody, and government's primary role is to make sure that it's protecting government, not government, like common resources. So I really do think that there is a big opportunity. It's just a matter of where is it on the government's priority list. And that's where, as citizens, as we should be advocating that those are things that we really care about and we demand. And so I'll give one example. There is so today, some of the actions that corporates are doing right now. So there is a corporate action network. So all the top corporates in Malaysia have gotten together to embrace ESG. So this is everybody from committees chaired by Petronas, and you've got the likes. It's pretty much everybody. I think Microsoft is also a part of that. I'm part of that as well. A little bit behind in my commitments, but yeah, we're part of that. But basically, we've all gotten together to say if we use our collective corporate position, whether you're an MNC or a GLC, you can drive impact and awareness to all your constituency, i.e. your customers and your suppliers and whatnot, and therefore create a bigger demand so that we can do more and affect more government policies even. So that's the idea. So I look forward to hearing more about green steps. And Rizal, I'll just ping me. Maybe we can brainstorm some things there, or at the very least, we could connect you to the Corporate Action Network, and maybe there's some opportunities there as well.
All right, thank you, Surina. Jayant, any additional answers, comments to that?
I don't have much to add. I think Surina has answered quite well, except I guess to say that, I think the whole innovation space creates a number of win-win type opportunities. I gave the example earlier about the solar parks in Cambodia, where, you provide, much needed electricity, which is a key ingredient to poverty reduction to isolated communities, while also not adding to the whole environmental problem. In fact, while doing it in a very clean way. So it's not there are lots of those sorts of win-win opportunities, I think, that the whole innovation space creates and provides. That's not the issue. I mean, we can do those because they're good and no one loses. It's the win-lose trade-offs that we have to deal with, and unfortunately, those are the big ones, right? To do with emissions and carbon. So that's where it becomes more difficult, because there are winners and losers in the short run, and we have to do that calculation. There's resistance from groups that will, pay the price for the greater good in the long term. And how do we get, through that? That's the big challenge. One way is to go the, our hands are tied approach, which governments can use if they commit to, multilateral agreements, like with carbon and Paris, but there's also other things, right, at the regional level. The CPTPP, we talked a lot about data and digital trade earlier, that Jasmine mentioned especially. The CPTPP has a very detailed digital chapter, and Malaysia hasn't ratified it. So we have to see, what that tells us about the commitment to this area. I mean, the agreement, of course, is wide-ranging. There are lots of other issues in there, but it's a much more developing country-friendly agreement compared to the original version, the DPP, which I wasn't a fan of at all. But there has to be, we have to read the tea leaves. It looks like there is concern because of this sort of win-lose type trade-offs that do exist. But sometimes these take time also. We can't rush things, but there is a broader governance issue here, of course, in the whole management of the digital adoption arena. And this is why we do see some countries better prepared than others. Yeah.
All right. And Jayant, I suppose the second question is also related to ASEAN as a region. And perhaps I also need some input and insights from Jasmine, someone who deals on the Southeast Asian markets. Now, the questions say, can you set the data sharing and data privacy scenes in ASEAN? What are the key challenges? Are we looking to have a standardized approach for the whole region? So I guess the question is asking about the legality or are we allowed actually to have a data sharing and privacy scene in ASEAN, considering to the fact that ASEAN has its own member countries and these member countries have its own laws and regulations when it comes to data. Even so that these countries have its own law, can ASEAN as an entity of region gives the overall rules that allow or do not allow data sharing and privacy in ASEAN? So what was your point on that, Jayant?
Okay, I'll start off, but I'm sure Jasmine has a lot to say on this. I think the first thing to recognize about ASEAN as an institution is that it's one that's doesn't really interfere too much in the sovereign decisions of its members, right? My favorite saying about ASEAN is that it's all carrot and no stick. So unless countries see the benefit of adopting policies in their national interests, there is no enforcement mechanism that comes into play. I mean, ASEAN has a dispute settlement mechanism, but it's never been used. And it's gone institution light on purpose. Right? People often, have these long debates about how to strengthen the ASEAN Secretariat, for instance. But the ASEAN Secretariat is underpowered by design, right? This is not an accident. I mean, there is no appetite to surrender sovereignty to a supranational body in this region, unlike in the EU, for instance. And I don't see that changing in my lifetime, and perhaps not in many lifetimes. But so that's how the ASEAN institution operates. But that doesn't mean that it cannot succeed in doing things. It has a greater challenge on convincing its membership of the benefits and of the long-term benefits versus short-run adjustment costs, right? And that's quite difficult. That's difficult for national governments. It's more difficult at the regional level, but that's the challenge that they need to overcome. And you've got countries moving at different speeds. Jasmine earlier spoke about the DPAs that Singapore has been pursuing, almost leading the world, actually, in negotiating these digital agreements. And they're doing it with countries outside ASEAN, right? Australia, New Zealand, Chile, because, they see that that's where the appetite is. There's not enough within the region. And hopefully this will lead to catch up with other members rather than a splintering of the grouping. But that we'll have to wait and see. RCEP, which includes all of ASEAN, doesn't cover data or digital trade, but CPTPP that has 4 ASEAN countries and that might provide a better building block for digital, with more ASEAN members joining perhaps, could be the better forum rather than ASEAN. I think ASEAN is not really designed in such a way that it can handle this very effectively, given its consensus-based inclusive approach, which is good for other things, but not for a difficult issue like this one. Yeah, but I'll let Jasmine talk about these details, I think. Yeah.
Thank you,
Jasmine.
Yeah, sure. So I was just looking at the date when the Talmin meeting happened, and on the 22nd of January in 2021, the data management framework and the model contractual clauses for cross-border data flow for ASEAN was actually ratified by all ASEAN member countries. It is voluntary, you know, you become, you certify or you become a member and you adapt some of the model contractual clauses. So there is a legal framework built upon the previous framework that was the privacy framework that was introduced in 2016. So in 2021, there is the model contractual clauses that has been introduced, while the ASEAN member states have all ratified and accepted it, but it is up to individual countries, to Jayant's point, how do you want to adapt and adapt? What is interesting is that most of the countries in the ASEAN region have gone on to also accept the standards introduced in GDPR as the basis of their own individual national data privacy laws. So let's look at Malaysia's Personal Data Protection Act. The PDPA actually allows for data to be hosted outside of Malaysia in a country that has a better regime, or at least an equivalent one to Malaysia. So data primarily has been allowed. What the Commission was trying to do is to actually introduce a whitelist. And that is still in motion. We know there's a draft sitting somewhere, but that hasn't been announced. So as far as ASEAN is concerned, there is a framework. There is also a legal basis for that with the model contractual clauses and certification. So the short answer is today there is a framework already in place for data sharing. And most countries within ASEAN are looking to at least allow to a certain aspect, especially when it comes to businesses, for free flow of data. The reason being, if you do not allow for free flow of data, it impedes digital economy, and the cost of just having data localization would go through the roof. So especially with startups and scale-ups, they want to go to countries that are friendly, and we have seen that progressively being done in countries like Thailand that gone on to position itself as the office to the world. It is interesting how they want to become the open space working for the world, and they are positioning Thailand. So it becomes even more critical now that that the free flow of data becomes central to actually how digital policies are made. But what is also interesting was the point that Puan Surina made about, do you know your data? Do you classify your data? Do you know your data estate? And that remains a challenge. Assets used to be tagged, and they would know exactly, go and look under the table or under the chair to see that asset tagging. But do we have the skills to actually asset tag our data and know what is the size of our data and how do we actually turn that data into insights? So the point is, having data is one thing, but having the skill to turn it into insight is another. Zokhri, back to you.
Thank you, Jasmine. The next question is about SDG. SDG is actually on the Sustainability Development Goals by 2030. I think on the insights, we know that digitalizations will create sustainability in our business and our day-to-day life. So the question asked, and I think perhaps Jayant, if you want to kickstart with the answering of the questions, is like, may you explain, does digitalization able to meet up SDG by 2030. Do you think ASEAN countries able to meet up the expectation based on the current economic situations? I think that the person is asking is saying that while we are on track for SDG 2030, do we see that this COVID-19 and the implications of our economy right now at the moment perhaps hinder the progress towards the goals in 2030? Jayant.
Right. Okay. So I'm not too sure that we are really on track for meeting most of the SDGs, I'm afraid. Certainly the poverty reduction target is on track or ahead of schedule, which before the pandemic. I mean, this is the problem with the pandemic, is reversing, decades of progress that we've made in just a matter of a couple of years, right? Less than a couple of years, and it's not over yet. So it's very difficult to actually recalibrate our current situation in terms of where we are and how likely we are to get there by 2030. But I think the questioner is asking about how the whole OIR can help in getting us there. I think it has a even bigger role now to play, given the backsliding we've seen in the social outcomes, in poverty. There is a real risk of permanent increase in the number of the poor at the end of this pandemic that will take generations to reverse, right? And then you've got the unequal access to education and training and schooling that threatens to perpetuate an intergenerational cycle of poverty. When before, education was the escape of the poor from poverty. Now it's working in reverse to create a greater pool going forward. And unfortunately, these things ratchet down or up. So, it can spiral in one direction or the other. Will now it's looking like it's spiraling the wrong direction. But the digital technologies will have to play a bigger role, I think, and I hope that they will, but time will tell. Unfortunately, we're not looking too good now, but first we better get over this pandemic and then try and deal with its consequences.
Yeah, to add on to that, the pandemic, just because it's really restricted movement, and unfortunately with the underprivileged communities, I mean, movement is actually key, because they're disconnected. And so as Dr. Jasmine said earlier, first step, you got to get them connected, you got to get them access, and then you got to get them trained. Today, a lot of the people are getting trained online. And so last year, for example, we had this e-commerce training program targeted to micro SMEs, and that we were able to actually pivot quite quickly and quite effectively going online. But these were there were plenty of people that were in rural areas that were doing that, but the challenge was that literally they were all sharing one phone, and that phone also happened to be the phone that the kids needed to access education as well. And so this is a huge issue, that how do we address access? How do we address connectivity? There are things that the government, for example, has announced, announced getting devices out to people. But again, the implementation is slow. And so every single part, everything matters. And so how do you go about, it comes back to execution again. How do you go about doing that?
I guess the way that we are actually addressing the issue of COVID-19 in ASEAN is not actually to put ourselves into are we able or not to achieve the target? are we able or not to escape from this pandemic? But the discussion today is more on exposing to the hows, exposing to the methodologies of certain ways. What can we do in our own capacity, in our firm's capacity, in order to escape ourselves from COVID? That is why we've heard from Microsoft in terms of policy regulation. These are the things that we probably should focus. I think on behalf of MDEC, Surina talks about the efforts and the channels that has been provided to ease up Malaysians to weather the pandemic. So yeah, I kind of like resonate to that actually, rather than we think that are we able to escape? Are we able to win over this? But rather we take a step back and think, what can we do from our own individual capacity, or given any power or organizations that we have to escape ourselves and to help our surroundings to weather the pandemic. Yeah, that's, I think that's a very, very good approach. And I think Jayant actually especially mentions on these issues and all of these problems that we have. Certainly the inequality is real. We are not denying that. But at the same time, Surina points out rather aptly by saying that COVID accelerates few things. It exacerbates few things. It worsens few things. In fact, those are really real and really deep to our heart. We can actually see that. But it has also pushes and it also drives a few things. So I think it's the choice that we should take, whether we should leverage on the choice and options given the pandemic is here, or we should just, sit back and be negative from time to time. So it's 10 to 12, and I think we've answered all questions from our viewers, also to reflect on to the discussions. Before we end these sessions today, let me just check whether we have any other questions on the chat. Nope, I've answered all that. There's one in the chat list by Rizal. Okay, again, this is about SDG. This is about SDG 8. The SDG 8 is about to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. How does ASEAN going to make this? Each country is at a different economic development maturity. Perhaps, Jayant, just a very quick on that question, if you may.
Right. Okay. I'm just actually reading it again. Okay. So yeah, SDG 8 on inclusive growth. This is one of those all-encompassing SDGs, and I guess the question is about, given the diversity within ASEAN, how can they meet it? Yeah, well, I think that's the big question, big challenge, right? I mean, some countries, I mean, there's not one ASEAN, unfortunately, whatever we like to say or whatever the rhetoric is. I mean, there's at least three. There's the high-income countries, there's the middle income, and then there's the, LDCs as well. And so each are struggling to overcome their challenges. But there's been rapid catch-up in the newest member countries, right? Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam especially. Vietnam is now, during this pandemic, been a star. It's not immune, of course, as we've learned. No one is immune from the new variants, but it's done very well in managing the crisis. It's also a country that didn't have a single quarter of negative economic growth last year, right? So, which is a remarkable achievement, while sensibly doing managed lockdown. So there is a lot of catch up. The Cambodia, Myanmar is having political problems, but Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were growing at much faster rates than the rest of ASEAN. That suggests convergence, but price of that sort of rapid growth has been rising internal inequality, right? So while we are reducing inter-country inequality, this is happening at the expense of within country inequality. And that's something we need to try and address going forward. Everything has changed now with the pandemic in terms of that record, but the fundamental challenges remain. The pandemic hasn't changed that, of increasing inclusion. It's created some opportunities through acceleration of the digital economy, but it's created new problems that will take a long time to address. So bottom line is, I don't think we'll get there, unfortunately, by 2030. This is a very loosely defined SDG anyway, but we won't get there. We're less likely to get closer to it than we were before the pandemic. But again, we are still in not just the middle of the pandemic. In this region, in many countries, we are the worst point of the pandemic. So we can't really start talking about what we do after the pandemic. Let's talk about how we get out of this pandemic first. Yeah.
Thank you, Jayant. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming towards the end of the sessions today. But before I close the session, I would like to give a round of our speakers to give their final remarks or some sort of a conclusion and wrap up before I close the session. So we will go with Surina, and then to Jasmine, and then to Jayant. So Surina, if you may.
Thank you very much. So I talked about in my talk earlier, the importance of operationalizing policies. That's really, really important. And I think when we talk about operationalizing things, I think corporations, for example, very used to thinking about sustainability, just business sustainability. Now there's a lot of talk around environmental sustainability, but where we are today in this overall, even when we think about 4IR, think about digital, if there is no societal sustainability, it doesn't matter either. So that's why this inclusion agenda, societal sustainability, it's not just government's responsibility. Of course, government bears the bigger brunt of that, but it's everybody's responsibility as well. And so core to that, like the call to action, really is empathy. And so ensure that in whatever it is that we do, there is empathy in your day-to-day, empathy in business operations, empathy in policy, empathy in everything. So that would be my closing remarks for me.
Yes, Jasmine, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to build on what Surina said about people and empathy. And I want to keep to the theme of people in the center of everything that we do. And while we think about technology being this magic enabler, but at the center of it all are the people. And we need to anchor it onto the people. And even if it is policy, it has to be made for the people and how it impacts people. It cannot be made in a bubble. Policies are real. It has there's impact on people. And we need to realize that as we think about, we have an opportunity. The pandemic has given us an opportunity to be more people-centric in our policy making. We've seen this in education. We have seen this in healthcare. And I would like to come back to say, as we think about policy, especially policy in relation to technology, it needs to be centrally anchored on people. And I'll continue to advocate for that. And one parting remark is that if we think about people with disability are further impacted. And as we think about these policies, we need to think about how do we provide an opportunity for them to be mainstreamed into economy and not pushed back into kebajikan or charity. It has to be about mainstreaming them into economy, and technology has a big role to play, and ASEAN could lead by example. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Jayant?
I was going to say something else, but I don't think I can break away from the theme that Surina has started, which I think is, a critical and very important theme, which is the people orientation of all our policies. So I won't go off on some macroeconomic policy prescription about capital mobility. So I think, yes, people...
still people in capital mobility there.
Yes, absolutely. At the end of the day, correct. It comes back to how it affects people. And I think, as both of you have highlighted, this pandemic has been a bigger burden on the poor, on the marginalized. We've seen how it's been unequal, not just in terms of direct impacts of the pandemic. The poor have weaker immune systems and less access to healthcare before and during, and it seems after the pandemic. So they've been directly affected in a worse way by the pandemic, and also by all the measures taken to contain the community spread of the pandemic. I think, Surina, you mentioned earlier about how the poor or the low skilled have to engage in physical contact in most of their employment categories, right? In construction and so in manufacturing, you cannot, like a lot of us, stare at a computer and make a living. Unfortunately, they have to actually engage in physical contact. And so this is something that has, the lockdowns or social distancing measures has affected them a lot more than the others. And they're now made worse off as a result. So, the worst, I guess, are the people that are stateless, right? The undocumented foreign workers throughout this region and beyond. We've seen them suffer the greatest effects, and we should not forget them. And we need to think about better ways of including them, formalizing these workers so that they don't pose, a threat to the host country in terms of security. Also, they're not, subject to all forms of abuses because they don't have any legal protection. So I think, this pandemic has reminded us how we are all, we are all in it together, to use a much used cliche, but it's true. And I think it's been called an equal opportunity infector. That's true, but then that it's also true that the poor the poor and the marginalized have suffered the most, and we should take extra care to make sure that their needs are also addressed. That's a very long closing statement, so let me stop there. Thank you.
It's okay, we are still on time, but regardless, thank you, Jayant, thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, Surina, for all of your thoughts, your insights, as well as your experience and how can we weather the COVID-19 pandemic via digital economy. Also, thank you to all our listeners and viewers for participating in IDEA's second online discussion entitled ASEAN's Digital Economy and the Post-COVID Recovery. Now, this online discussions today is part of our ongoing project on ASEAN Prosperity Index initiative that IDEA is working with some other think tanks to foster ASEAN's ability to escape the region from the pandemic. So there will be more online discussion, there will be more forums, there will be more op-eds that will be produced. And one of these is been themed as digital economy. So do follow us up in our recent and as well as our ongoing activities. And let's not stop here when we discuss on digital economy. IDEAS will be very much happy to host any formal or informal discussions when it comes to digital economy. We are together with Microsoft, we are together with MDEC to promote digital economy in our country as well as in ASEAN. And on behalf of IDEAS, we would like to also record our special thanks to ISEAS, the Yusof Ishak Institute of Singapore, for these collaborations. And we hope that there will be more collaborations, not only in digital economy, but also on other aspects. To Microsoft Malaysia, thank you, Jasmine, for agreeing to do this. Again, if we are both together in this advocacy project of digitalizations and the policy gig. Let's do it together as a team. Also to MDEC, thank you, Surina, for agreeing to do this. Again, we are all in this together. IDEAS also believes in the importance of advocacy of all of our policies, and digital economy is also one of our key enablers towards a more sustainable Malaysia. That's what we believe. So there are more projects coming on from the three of us, also from a joint project together. So to all of our listeners and viewers out there, let's not stop here. Do follow us in all of our companies' profile, companies' LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and hopefully the ecosystem of digital economy that we actually aspiring to have in the future will become clearer day by day. Perhaps today is not that much clear, but at least we have make it clearer. Tomorrow it will be clearer until it becomes a reality. And we are doing this for the betterment of Malaysia as one of the countries of ASEAN, as well as to all ASEAN member countries. With that, once again, IDEAS would like to thank each and every one of you for the discussions today, and we hope to see you again in the future. Do follow us up in all our social media in IDEAS for MDEC, for Microsoft, as well as for Yusof ISEAS Institute of Singapore. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And I'll close this sessions with wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah, wassalamu alaikum. And I wish each and every one of you a very pleasant day ahead. Stay safe, stay home, and please be vigilant. Thank you.